The winter morning bit hard into Thomas Chen's weathered face as he trudged through the deep snow, checking the boundaries of his Montana farm. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. His breath came out in white puffs, dancing in the crisp mountain air. It was the kind of cold that made every farmer think twice about leaving their warm bed, but Thomas had his routines, and he stuck to them like clockwork. He'd inherited this piece of land from his father, who'd taught him that a farmer's morning walk wasn't just about checking fences, it was about listening to what the land had to say. Today, the land spoke through the crunch of his boots in the fresh snow and the distant cry of winter birds. As Thomas rounded the edge of the pine forest that marked his property line, something caught his ear. A sound that didn't belong in the usual morning symphony. A weak whimper, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the trees. He paused, his gloved hand resting on a fence post, and listened more carefully. There it was again. This time he was sure. Following the sound, Thomas carefully made his way through the snow-laden branches. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate. As he pushed aside a low-hanging pine branch, his heart nearly stopped at what he saw, a wolf cub, no bigger than his farm cat, caught in an old hunting snare. The tiny creature's gray fur was dusted with snow, and a white crescent marking on its chest stood out like a beacon. Its left front paw was tangled in the wire, and spots of red stained the snow beneath. When it saw Thomas, the cub tried to back away, but only managed to hurt itself more. "Easy there, little one." Thomas spoke softly, crouching down to appear less threatening. He'd seen plenty of wolves in his 58 years of farming, usually from a distance, and usually as a signal to check on his livestock. But this was different. This wasn't a predator, it was just a baby, scared and hurting. The cub's golden eyes locked with his, filled with a mix of fear and something else, maybe hope, or maybe that was just Thomas's imagination playing tricks on him. He knew he should probably call the Wildlife Service. That would be the sensible thing to do. But the temperature was dropping fast, and the nearest help was hours away. As Thomas weighed his options, the cub let out another whimper, this one weaker than before. That sound made the decision for him. Slowly, he removed his thick winter gloves and reached into his coat pocket for the multi-tool he always carried, a habit his father had drilled into him years ago. "I'm going to help you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you've got to trust me just a little." The next few minutes felt like hours as Thomas carefully worked to free the cub. He talked the whole time, keeping his voice steady and calm, the way he did with spooked horses. The cub watched him, occasionally trying to pull away, but seeming to understand, somehow, that this strange human was trying to help. Finally, with one last careful snip, the snare fell away. The cub immediately tried to stand but stumbled, its injured paw unable to bear weight. It wouldn't survive long in this condition, not with the brutal Montana winter in full swing and predators around every corner. Thomas looked up at the sky, now a clear winter blue, and then back at the wounded cub. He thought about what his neighbors would say. He thought about the risks. He thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. Then he took off his warm wool scarf, the one his sister had knitted for him last Christmas, and slowly reached toward the trembling cub. Sometimes, he said to himself, remembering his father's words, doing the right thing isn't the same as doing the smart thing. The cub didn't fight when he gently wrapped it in the scarf. Maybe it was too weak, or maybe, just maybe, it sensed his genuine desire to help. As Thomas cradled the small bundle against his chest, he felt the rapid beating of its tiny heart. "Well, little one," he said, starting the long walk back to his farmhouse, "I hope we both don't end up regretting this." The wind picked up, swirling snow around them as Thomas carried his unexpected charge home. He didn't know it then, but this morning's decision would set in motion events that would change his life forever. The drive back to Thomas's farmhouse felt longer than usual, with the injured wolf cub bundled carefully in his scarf on the passenger seat of his old pickup truck. Every bump in the snow-covered road made him wince, worried about causing the little creature more pain. The cub had remained surprisingly quiet, only whimpering softly when the truck hit a particularly rough patch. As Thomas pulled up to his weathered red barn, his mind raced with doubts. His neighbor Rick's words from last summer echoed in his head. "Wild animals belong in the wild, Thomas. Getting mixed up with them only leads to trouble." Rick wasn't wrong. Thomas had seen enough in his years of farming to know that nature followed its own rules, and humans often made things worse by interfering. But as he glanced at the small bundle beside him, those golden eyes met his again, and he knew he couldn't turn back now. The barn was warmer than outside, though that wasn't saying much on a Montana winter morning. Thomas had always kept it well maintained, with sturdy walls that blocked the worst of the wind. He used the back corner as a makeshift veterinary station before, nursing injured farm animals back to health. Today, it would serve a different purpose. He cleared out an empty stall, laying down fresh straw and setting up an old heat lamp he used for baby chicks in spring. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as his mind wandered to all the ways this could go wrong. Taking in a wolf cub, even a tiny one, wasn't like helping an injured sheep or a sick cow. "All right, little one," he murmured, gently lifting the bundle from his truck. "Let's get you fixed up." The cub was more alert now, its eyes darting around the barn interior. Thomas could feel its body trembling as he carefully unwrapped his scarf. The wound on its paw looked worse in the barn's light. The snare had cut deep, and there was dirt in the gash that would need cleaning. Thomas had learned basic animal care from his father, and years of farming had taught him even more. He gathered his supplies: warm water, clean cloths, antiseptic, and bandages. All the while, he kept talking to the cub in a low, steady voice, the way he would with a frightened horse. "You know, I probably should have thought this through better," he said, dampening a cloth with warm water. "I don't even know what wolves eat at your age. Guess we'll have to figure that out together." The cub watched his every move, but didn't try to bite or scratch as he cleaned the wound. It flinched when the antiseptic stung, but otherwise remained still, as if understanding that this temporary pain was helping. Thomas worked quickly but carefully, wrapping the paw in a light bandage that would protect the injury while allowing the cub some movement. "There we go," he said, sitting back on his heels. "That should feel a bit better." The cub tested its bandaged paw, putting just a little weight on it before pulling back. Its fur was still matted with snow and dirt, but Thomas figured that could wait. He pushed his luck far enough for one day. He set up a small enclosure using some old fence panels, making sure it was secure but comfortable. A bowl of fresh water went in one corner, and he laid his scarf in another to give the cub something soft to lie on. The heat lamp cast a warm glow over the space, creating a cozy shelter from the winter cold. As Thomas watched the cub explore its temporary home, reality started sinking in. He'd have to be careful, keep this quiet from his neighbors, figure out proper food, and most importantly, remember that this wasn't a pet. This was a wild animal that needed just enough help to survive, nothing more. That evening, after making some calls to a friend who worked at a wildlife sanctuary 2 counties over, Thomas returned to the barn with some raw meat cut into small pieces. The cub was curled up on his scarf, but lifted its head at his approach. Its ears perked up at the smell of food. "Your dinner, young lady," Thomas said, having noticed earlier that the cub was female. "My friend says this should work for now, but we'll get you on a proper diet tomorrow." He placed the meat through the fence and stepped back, watching as the cub cautiously approached the food. After sniffing it carefully, she began to eat, her movements becoming more eager with each bite. Thomas couldn't help but smile. "I suppose you need a name," he said, settling onto a hay bale nearby. "Can't keep calling you little one forever." He watched as moonlight filtered through the barn window, catching the white crescent marking on her chest. "Luna," he decided. "That'll do just fine." As if in response, Luna looked up from her meal, meeting his eyes again. In that moment, Thomas felt a connection he couldn't quite explain, something that went beyond simply helping an injured animal. It was a feeling that both warmed his heart and worried him, because he knew that the harder part was still to come. Someday he would have to let her go. The weeks passed slowly on Thomas's farm as winter held its grip on the Montana landscape. Each morning he'd wake before sunrise, his joints a bit stiffer than they used to be, and make his way to the barn to check on Luna. And each morning she'd be waiting, those bright golden eyes following his every move. Luna's recovery was steady but gradual. Thomas changed her bandages daily, noting with satisfaction how the deep gash from the snare was healing cleanly. She'd stopped pulling away during these sessions, instead watching him with what he could swear was trust in her eyes. Sometimes she'd even lean into his touch, moments that both warmed his heart and worried him, knowing she couldn't get too comfortable with human contact. "You're getting stronger every day," Thomas said one morning, watching Luna test her healing paw. She moved with increasing confidence, though she still favored it slightly. The small enclosure he built now seemed to barely contain her energy, and she'd taken to pacing its perimeter, especially at night when the calls of wild wolves echoed across the valley. Those howls were a constant reminder of what Luna truly was, not a pet, but a wild creature who needed to return to her own kind. Thomas had learned more about wolves in the past few weeks than he had in all his years of farming. His friend from the wildlife sanctuary had given him books to read, teaching him about wolf behavior and the importance of not domesticating them too much. He followed these guidelines carefully, keeping his interactions with Luna limited to necessary care. But there were moments, quiet moments, when he'd sit on his hay bale, drinking coffee and watching her explore her space, when the line between wild and tame seemed to blur. One particularly cold morning, Thomas arrived at the barn to find Luna had somehow managed to knock over her water bowl. As he bent to clean up the spill, she did something unexpected. She approached him directly, without her usual caution, and gently nudged his hand with her nose. "Well, look who's getting bold," he chuckled, fighting the urge to scratch behind her ears like he would with a dog. Instead, he slowly stood and retrieved fresh water, aware of her watching him with those intelligent eyes. She'd grown considerably over the weeks, her puppy fluff giving way to a sleeker coat that hinted at the adult wolf she would become. During the day, Thomas went about his usual farm work, fixing fences, checking on his small herd of cattle, and preparing for the eventual spring planting. But he found himself taking more breaks than usual, drawn back to the barn to observe Luna's progress. He started bringing his lunch there, sitting on his hay bale while she explored her enclosure with increasing agility. Sometimes he talked to her, sharing stories about his day or memories of his father teaching him to farm this land. "You know," he said one afternoon, watching as she practiced pouncing on a piece of straw, "my father always said that everything in nature has its purpose. Even the wolves that sometimes scared our livestock, he said they kept the balance." Luna paused in her play to look at him, head tilted slightly as if actually listening. These moments made Thomas smile, even as they reminded him that their time together was temporary. The turning point came one crisp morning when Thomas entered the barn to find Luna had managed to climb onto a stack of hay bales near her enclosure. She stood there proudly, perfectly balanced on her now-healed paw, looking more like a wild wolf than ever before. The sight stopped him in his tracks. "Showing off, are you?" he said, but his voice caught slightly. She was ready. He'd known this day would come, had prepared for it from the start, but that didn't make it any easier. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas sat in the barn longer than usual. Luna had settled into her favorite corner, the one where she could see both him and the barn door. The old scarf he used to carry her that first day was still there, now worn and carrying her scent. "We've got a decision to make, Luna," he said softly. He'd been careful not to use her name too often, another reminder that she wasn't a pet, but tonight it slipped out naturally. "You're strong enough now. Those calls you hear at night, that's where you belong." As if on cue, a distant howl floated through the evening air. Luna's ears perked up immediately, and she rose to face the barn door, her body tense with instinct. But then she did something that made Thomas's heart ache. She turned back to look at him, as if torn between two worlds. "Don't worry about me," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I've got my farm to keep me busy, and you've got a whole world out there waiting for you." That night, as Thomas walked back to his house under a sky full of stars, he realized that helping Luna heal hadn't just been about saving a wild animal. Somehow, during these quiet weeks in the barn, this young wolf had helped heal something in him too, a loneliness he hadn't even known he was carrying. Tomorrow would bring hard decisions, but for now, Thomas let himself feel grateful for this unexpected gift, the trust of a wild creature, and the reminder that sometimes the most meaningful connections come from simply doing what feels right, even when it's not easy. Spring came early that year to the Montana mountains, bringing with it the sweet scent of melting snow and fresh grass. Thomas watched as patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the white blanket that had covered his farm all winter. The morning air still carried a bite, but the promise of warmth hung just around the corner. He'd been putting this day off for almost a week now, finding endless small tasks that needed his attention. A fence that needed fixing, a barn door that needed oiling, anything to delay what he knew had to be done. But he couldn't wait any longer. Luna was ready, more than ready, to return to the wild. The signs were all there. She'd grown restless in her enclosure, pacing more frequently, especially at night when the wolf calls echoed through the valley. Her body had filled out, sleek and strong, all traces of the injured cub he'd found in the snow long gone. The white crescent on her chest stood out boldly against her gray fur, now thick and healthy. That morning, Thomas woke before dawn and sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He'd planned this carefully, choosing a remote area deep in the national forest where he knew wolf packs roamed. His friend from the wildlife sanctuary had helped him pick the spot, far enough from farms and ranches to give Luna the best chance at finding her own kind. "It's time," he said to himself, finally pushing away from the table. The words felt heavy in the quiet morning air. In the barn, Luna was already awake, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. As he approached her enclosure, she came to meet him, no longer the frightened cub that had trembled at his touch. Thomas opened the gate and crouched down, allowing himself one moment, just one, to run his hand along her back. "You've been a good guest," he said softly, his voice rougher than usual. "But you've got bigger things waiting for you out there." He prepared a transport crate, lined with fresh straw and the old scarf she'd first arrived in. Luna went in without resistance, as if she too knew this day was different. The drive to the release site was quiet, broken only by the crunch of gravel under his truck's tires and the occasional soft whine from the crate. Thomas had chosen this spot carefully. A clearing backed by dense forest, with a small stream running nearby. Everything a young wolf would need to find her way. As he parked the truck and walked around to the crate, his steps felt heavier than usual. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows through the trees. Bird songs filled the air, and somewhere in the distance, a deer crashed through the underbrush. This was wolf country, wild and untamed, just as it should be. Thomas set the crate down in the clearing and took a deep breath. This was the part he'd been dreading most. With slightly shaking hands, he opened the crate door. Luna didn't bolt out immediately as he half expected. Instead, she emerged slowly, her nose working overtime to process all the new scents. She took a few steps forward, then looked back at Thomas, and in that moment, his heart nearly broke. "Go on," he said gently, making a shooing motion with his hands. "This is your world now." Luna took a few more steps, then paused again. A bird called overhead, making her look up sharply. Her whole body seemed to quiver with the excitement of new sensations, new possibilities. But still she hesitated. Then, as if answering an unheard call, a wolf's howl echoed through the trees. Luna's ears shot forward, her body tensing. The howl came again, closer this time. She took several quick steps toward the sound, then turned back to Thomas one last time. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Thomas saw something that would stay with him forever, not the grateful eyes of a rescued animal, but the proud gaze of a wild creature returning to where she belonged. She held his gaze for a long moment, as if memorizing his face, then turned and looked into the forest with confident strides. Thomas stood there long after she'd disappeared, watching the spot where she vanished into the trees. The old scarf was still in the crate, and he picked it up, running his fingers over the worn fabric. It still carried a few of her hairs, a last tangible reminder of their time together. As he drove home, the empty crate rattling in the back of his truck, Thomas thought about how some of life's most meaningful moments come from letting go. His father had taught him that everything in nature has its season, a time to help and a time to step back, a time to hold on and a time to release. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, a wolf's howl echoed across the valley. It was probably his imagination, but he could have sworn it sounded familiar. He smiled, picturing Luna running free with her own kind, exactly where she was meant to be. Sometimes, he realized, the best way to keep something in your heart is to set it free in the wild. 3 years passed like seasons changing on Thomas's Montana farm. Springs turned to summers, summers faded into falls, and winters wrapped everything in white before starting the cycle again. The barn where Luna had stayed remained mostly unchanged, though Thomas had eventually cleared out the makeshift enclosure. He'd kept her old scarf, though, tucked away in a drawer where he'd sometimes find it while looking for other things. Life had a way of moving forward, whether you were ready or not. Thomas's hair had more grey now, and his morning walks took a little longer than they used to. Still, he maintained his routines, checking fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, and keeping the farm running just as his father had taught him. Sometimes, on his early morning rounds, he'd spot wolves in the distance. They'd become more common in these parts over the years, something that worried his neighbor Rick to no end. But Thomas would just nod and listen to Rick's concerns, keeping his own thoughts about wolves to himself. "You really ought to get some help around here," Rick would say during their occasional coffee meetings at the local diner. "Farm's too much work for one person." He wasn't wrong. Thomas felt it more with each passing season, but hiring help meant bringing strangers into his quiet world, and he wasn't quite ready for that. One crisp fall morning, Thomas noticed fresh wolf tracks near his cattle pasture. The prints were clear in the mud from yesterday's rain, showing where a pack had passed through during the night. His cows were all accounted for, though, calm and undisturbed. It was odd. Over the past few years, his farm seemed to have fewer problems with predators than any other in the valley. He found himself studying these tracks more closely than usual. Some were large adult wolves, but others showed younger animals too. His mind wandered to Luna, wondering if she'd found her place among a pack, if she'd had cubs of her own by now. He'd seen a wolf with a white crescent marking once or twice over the years, always at a distance, but could never be sure if it was her. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, he heard the wolves. Their howls echoed across the valley, closer than usual. Instead of feeling worried, he felt a strange sense of peace. The sound brought back memories of those winter weeks in the barn, of golden eyes watching him with trust, of a connection he never expected to find. His life had developed a comfortable rhythm in these past 3 years. The local food bank still got regular deliveries of his extra vegetables, though he had to plant a smaller garden now. He'd switched to raising fewer cattle, focusing on quality over quantity. His sister called every Sunday from Seattle, always asking if he was eating enough and taking care of himself. The farm kept him busy, but there were quiet moments too. Moments when he'd find himself pausing in the barn doorway, remembering a small wolf cub curled up on an old scarf. Or times when he'd stop during his morning rounds, watching the mist rise off the mountains, thinking about how life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. Winter came early that year. Thomas had felt it in his bones weeks before the first snow fell, and he prepared accordingly. The barn was stocked with hay, the generator was serviced, and extra firewood was stacked neatly against the house. Experience had taught him that Montana winters showed no mercy to those who weren't ready. One particularly cold morning, Thomas noticed the generator running rough. It was an old machine, probably older than some of Rick's grandchildren, and it had been making strange noises for weeks. He'd been putting off repairs, waiting for a warmer day, but the forecast showed a big storm coming. He couldn't risk having it fail when he needed it most. As he worked on the generator behind the barn, his fingers stiff despite his thick gloves, Thomas thought he heard something in the distance. A wolf's howl, different from the others he usually heard. Something about it tugged at his memory, made him pause in his work and listen more carefully. The wind picked up, carrying snowflakes that danced in the air before settling on his coat. The temperature was dropping fast. He needed to finish this job quickly. But as he turned back to the generator, his boots slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Thomas felt himself falling, tried to catch himself, but his hand caught the edge of the generator instead. The heavy machine shifted on its platform, and for one terrible moment, time seemed to slow down. He saw the generator tipping, felt its weight coming toward him, and knew with sudden clarity that this was going to be bad. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Cold metal pinned him against the frozen ground, heavy and immovable. He tried to call out, but the pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe, let alone shout. His phone was in his coat pocket, trapped beneath him, completely out of reach. As consciousness began to fade around the edges, Thomas heard that wolf's howl again. Closer now. Through the swirling snow, he thought he saw a flash of grey fur, a glimpse of a white crescent marking. But that couldn't be right. Must be his mind playing tricks as the cold seeped into his bones. The last thing he remembered, before darkness took him, was the sound of multiple sets of paws running through the snow and a familiar pair of golden eyes looking into his. Cold. That was all Thomas could feel as consciousness flickered like a candle flame in the wind. The weight of the generator pressed against his chest, making each breath a struggle. Snowflakes fell silently around him, beginning to cover his coat in a thin white blanket. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the storm moved in, and he knew with terrifying clarity that if help didn't come soon, this remote corner of his farm would become his final resting place. He tried once more to free himself, but his arms had lost most of their strength in the cold. The generator didn't budge an inch. His legs were trapped at an awkward angle, and he could barely feel his feet anymore. The sun was setting behind thick clouds, taking with it what little warmth the winter day had offered. Through the growing darkness, Thomas heard it again, that distinctive howl that had caught his attention earlier. It sounded closer now, much closer. His mind, fuzzy from cold and lack of oxygen, drifted back to those days 3 years ago. He remembered a small wolf cub looking up at him with trust in her golden eyes, a white crescent marking on her chest like a signature from the moon itself. The howl came again, and this time it was answered by others. Multiple voices joined the chorus, creating a symphony that echoed across his snow-covered farm. Thomas tried to turn his head toward the sound, but even that small movement required more energy than he could muster. Then he saw them, shadows moving through the swirling snow. At first, he thought his oxygen-deprived brain was playing tricks on him. But no, these shadows were solid, real. Wolves emerged from the growing darkness, their fur dusted with snow, their breath visible in the frigid air. At their lead was a magnificent grey wolf, larger than the others, with a distinctive white crescent marking on her chest that seemed to glow in the fading light. She approached him without hesitation, and when their eyes met, Thomas felt a jolt of recognition that cut through his numbed senses. "Luna," he whispered, his voice barely a breath in the freezing air. The wolf, Luna, came closer, her nose touching his cold cheek. Her breath was warm against his skin, a stark contrast to the biting cold that had settled into his bones. She let out a soft whine, and suddenly the other wolves moved forward, as if responding to a silent command. What happened next seemed like something from a dream. The wolves began digging in the snow around him, their powerful paws moving earth and ice. 2 larger wolves positioned themselves on either side of the generator, using their bodies as leverage points. Luna stayed by his head, her presence a comfort in the growing darkness. Thomas felt the pressure on his chest ease slightly as the wolves worked. He didn't understand how they knew what to do, couldn't comprehend the complexity of their cooperation. All he knew was that these creatures, these wild, intelligent beings, were trying to save his life. With a collective effort that spoke of pack coordination, the wolves managed to shift the generator just enough. Luna immediately grabbed Thomas's coat collar with gentle but firm teeth, pulling him inch by inch away from the machine. The other wolves joined in, carefully helping to drag him clear of danger. Once free, Thomas lay in the snow, gulping in deep breaths of cold air. His chest hurt with every intake, but the sweet relief of being able to breathe fully again overshadowed the pain. Luna and her pack surrounded him, their bodies creating a warm barrier against the bitter wind and falling snow. He needed to get to the house, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The cold had seeped too deep, and the struggle had drained what little strength he had left. As if sensing his predicament, Luna pressed against his side, offering support. With her help, and with the other wolves flanking him, Thomas managed to slowly stand. The journey to his house was a blur of snow and shadow. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and cold, but every time he stumbled, the wolves were there, supporting him, guiding him. Luna stayed pressed against his side the entire time, matching her pace to his faltering steps. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, they reached his porch. Thomas's hands shook as he fumbled with his keys, but finally he managed to open the door. Warm air rushed out to meet him, and he nearly collapsed with relief. Before stepping inside, he turned to Luna. She stood on his porch, proud and wild, yet with the same trust in her eyes that he remembered from 3 years ago. The other wolves waited in the yard, their forms barely visible through the now heavy snow. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. Luna pressed her nose briefly against his palm, a gesture that bridged the gap between their worlds, before turning and leaping off the porch to join her pack. Thomas watched from his doorway as the wolves disappeared into the storm, their forms fading like ghosts into the swirling snow. Luna's howl echoed back one last time, a sound that seemed to carry both a goodbye and a promise. Inside his house, as feeling slowly returned to his frozen limbs, Thomas sat in his father's old armchair and thought about the miracle he'd just experienced. He'd saved Luna's life once, on a cold winter morning much like this one. Today, she had returned that favor, bringing with her the strength of an entire pack. Some might call it coincidence, or luck, or even divine intervention. But Thomas knew better. He knew it was something simpler and more profound, the pure-hearted connection between two living beings, transcending the boundaries between wild and tame, a debt repaid in the language of loyalty and trust. The days following Thomas's rescue brought changes to his quiet Montana farm. The morning after the storm, he found wolf tracks all around his property, not just near the generator where he'd been trapped, but forming protective circles around his house, barn, and cattle pasture. His animals were completely unharmed, peacefully grazing as if being watched over by a pack of wolves was the most natural thing in the world. Word spread quickly in their small farming community. Rick, his neighbor, was the first to visit after hearing about the accident from Thomas's sister during one of her worried check-in calls. He sat at Thomas's kitchen table, cup of coffee growing cold, as he listened to the incredible story. "Let me get this straight," Rick said, shaking his head in amazement. "That wolf cub you saved 3 years ago, the one I told you was a bad idea, she came back with her whole pack to save your life." Thomas nodded, sipping his own coffee. His chest still ached from the generator's weight, but the doctor in town had assured him nothing was broken. "Nature has its own way of keeping score," he said quietly, remembering his father's words about everything having its purpose. The winter winds continued to howl outside, but Thomas's farm felt different now. Each morning, he'd find fresh wolf tracks in the snow, evidence of Luna's pack patrolling his property through the night. They kept other predators away from his livestock and seemed to maintain a respectful distance from his house, except for Luna herself. She would appear sometimes at dawn or dusk, standing at the edge of the forest where it met his fields. Her white crescent marking made her unmistakable, even at a distance. She never came too close to the house when others were around, maintaining her wild nature, but Thomas would often spot her watching over his daily work from afar. One quiet evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset, Luna emerged from the trees and approached closer than usual. She moved with the confident grace of an alpha wolf, her coat thick and healthy, her golden eyes bright with intelligence. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. "You've done well for yourself," Thomas said softly, noting how she'd grown into such a magnificent creature. She tilted her head at the sound of his voice, so familiar yet still wild. Behind her, at the forest's edge, Thomas could see other wolves, her pack, waiting patiently. As if making a decision, Luna climbed the porch steps. Thomas remained still, hardly daring to breathe. She approached his chair and gently touched her nose to his hand, just as she had done years ago in the barn. The gesture was brief but filled with meaning, a bridge between their two worlds. After that evening, a new pattern emerged on Thomas's farm. Luna's pack became its unofficial guardians, keeping other predators at bay and somehow knowing exactly where to draw the line between protection and interference. They never bothered his cattle or came too close to the house when visitors were around, yet their presence was a constant comfort. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and bringing new life to the mountains. Thomas's sister visited from Seattle, helping him repair the generator and install safety measures he'd been putting off for too long. She noticed the wolf tracks around the property but said nothing, simply squeezing his hand with understanding. One morning, as Thomas walked his fence line checking for winter damage, he heard excited yipping sounds from the forest edge. There stood Luna, and beside her were 3 wolf cubs, their tiny forms bouncing with energy. She'd brought her family to show him, a gesture that made his heart swell with emotion. The cubs wrestled in the grass, while Luna watched both them and Thomas, her posture relaxed but alert. They all shared her distinctive coloring, and one even had a small white marking on its chest, though none quite like their mother's crescent moon. "Your own family," Thomas said softly, standing still as he watched the scene unfold. "You did good, Luna, real good." As the years passed, Thomas's farm gained a reputation in the valley. Some called it blessed, others called it strange, but everyone noticed how it thrived despite having fewer problems with predators than any other property in the area. The locals learned to accept the unusual sight of wolf tracks around Thomas's land, and gradually the story of the farmer and the wolf became part of the valley's folklore. Thomas himself grew older, his hair turning fully white, his steps becoming slower. But he never felt alone. Every morning he'd find fresh tracks in his yard, Luna's pack still faithfully watching over his farm. And on special evenings, when the moon was full and the air was clear, Luna would appear on his porch, sometimes with her growing family, maintaining their unique connection. He kept her old scarf in a special place, a reminder of that winter morning when he'd made the choice to help an injured wolf cub. That simple act of kindness had created something remarkable, a bond that transcended the usual boundaries between humans and wild animals, a friendship that asked nothing but gave everything. And so the story of Thomas and Luna became more than just a tale of rescue and repayment. It became a testament to the profound connections possible between all living beings, a reminder that kindness given freely often returns in unexpected ways, and proof that sometimes the most extraordinary relationships can grow from the simplest acts of compassion. Their story lived on in the valley, told and retold, a legacy of trust between a lonely farmer and a wild wolf who never forgot the hand that saved her. And on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind carries the sound of wolves howling across the Montana mountains, people say you can still see a wolf with a crescent moon on her chest, watching over the old farm, keeping her promise to the man who once showed her kindness.